Welcome to COIQ, a first-of-its-kind video program about health innovators, early adopters, and influencers, and their stories about riding the roller coaster of healthcare innovation. I'm your host, Dr. Roxy, founder of Legacy DNA Marketing Group, and it's time to raise our COIQ. On today's show, we're going to talk about why some healthcare innovations fail to commercialize and why some succeed. John Sharp is with us today. He's the Senior Manager for PCHA, the Personal Connected Health Alliance of HIMSS, and he's going to share why it's so difficult and so unique to commercialize an innovation in healthcare compared to other industries. He's also going to reveal 3 vital tactics that every health innovator needs to include in their commercialization plan. So John, let's start off the conversation by you just telling us a little bit about your background and what you do.
Okay, thanks. Glad to be here today. As you said, currently I'm a senior manager and I'm in charge of thought leadership for the Personal Connected Health Alliance. And we're the part of HIMSS that's focused on consumer-facing health IT, whereas most of HIMSS, if you're familiar with it, is more focused on providers and insurers and pharma and other areas. So we're really focused in on the apps and devices that patients and consumers use. My background is that I've always been interested in patient engagement. My first career, which lasted a good long time, was actually as a hospital social worker. But then I switched with the coming of all things internet to health IT. And most recently, before I joined HIMSS about 5 years ago, I was at the Cleveland Clinic in research informatics. So I have interest in research as well as patient engagement and apps and devices.
Gotcha. Great. What a wonderful background. So I'm going to start off, the conversation a little bit by talking about this stat that really is kind of like the foundation for the reason why we even have this show. So 95% of innovations that are brought to the market fail to commercialize. And so I'd like you to share some insights on why do you think some fail and some succeed?
Well, I think there are a lot of reasons. I think one aspect that may be beginning to change is that investors and founders of startup companies don't always understand the complexity of the healthcare industry. Mm-hmm. I think investors are getting a little smarter and realistic about that, which is encouraging. So I think that percentage hopefully will go down as a result, but there's still a lot of money available, a lot of people willing to invest, so that danger is still there. I think it might be extreme to say naivete of a lot of founders in this area and people involved in developing new apps and devices is not understanding their market. There's a lot of passion, as in any successful industry with startups, where the founders are very passionate about what they're trying to build. And a lot of that comes out of either a personal experience with a diagnosis or a life-threatening condition, or going through the healthcare experience with a family member. And as a result, they think because of their technical background and business background that they can fix this. And
right. Yep.
Then after 2 years into it and they're running out of money, they don't understand what happened, but they didn't understand the industry in the first place. And there are a couple other barriers I'll mention briefly. One is
Sure.
Provider organizations are traditionally very cautious and conservative. Mm-hmm. So you come, even a lot of them are allergic to the term disruption,
Right.
which is in total contrast to the startup world where, you break things, fail fast, and so on. And physicians and other healthcare providers are all about safety and not being sued. So you have these contrasting industries. Now that's changed. And another thing that's changing because you have a lot of large healthcare organizations that even now hire physicians based on entrepreneurship and have their own innovation centers and are funding startup companies and partnering with startup companies. So that then enables them to give an education to those startups that may seem like great ideas, but how does it fit into a specific need? I was talking to one startup originally in Chicago at the HealthBox Studio, which is a week-long advising session for, I think, 20 startups at a time, and talked to this one, and nicely, it was also a female founder, which is still somewhat rare, becoming less rare. And she had a fantastic idea about remote monitoring. The concern was, is everybody already doing that? They were also very involved in, had a good artificial intelligence background. Then I talked to her maybe, 4 months later in Cleveland at a plug and play event, and she said that they had really shifted as they talked to provider organizations, and provider organizations were focusing in on a specific need they had, and they could see how what they were developing, this startup, would fit that need. So that's a successful example, I think, where a lot of startups fail is engaging a provider organization or multiple provider organizations on a need that that organization has, rather than just saying, this is the greatest thing in the world, you should buy it, you should implement it at scale, which is unrealistic. So, and the other thing is, that's a story about getting your foot in the door, at least, and maybe doing a pilot study. The other problem, of course, is death by pilot, which a lot of people talk about. And part of the reason that occurs is, again, the different cultures. So if a startup has enough funding, venture funding, angel funding, maybe for a year or 2 years, if they're lucky, provider organizations don't move that fast yet. Some are beginning to move faster in this area, but by the time they do a study, go through all the regulatory stuff through the institutional review board, and I know that space. I was on an institutional review board at one time, and it's a very, again, conservative, deliberative group. And the other problem, of course, is a lot of the research folks, like on the institutional review board, don't understand digital health and how it can benefit patients. So they understand drugs and medical devices. So they need an education too about, don't create unrealistic barriers for these companies that may have something very useful and need to study it. So I think if you can get past some of those barriers with the right partner who has a need that you're going to fulfill, even if you have to pivot, maybe not pivot 180, but pivot somewhat, then I think you can be successful in that, in getting into a provider organization. So that's really more apps for that providers may implement with their patients. So it's more of a, B2B to C.
So what do you recommend for health innovators who are in the trenches and, maybe have funding to last them, another year, another 18 months? And that in itself is really like a win, right? So, what do you say to those health innovators that have about 12 to 18 months worth of funding left and that they're in the pilot phase? Any recommendations that you have?
Yeah, getting from pilot to scale, even within one organization, and with your own limited resources, is the real challenge. Not even talking about the next stage, which would be either acquisition or commercialization. I think the key would be having a partner who would, a provider organization that's willing to help them accelerate the process. So instead of continuing to knock on more doors and getting doors slammed in your face, find, if you already have somebody who's doing a pilot with you, I think talking with them, if this is successful, how are we going to scale it? How are we going to make this successful as a partnership to get beyond 40 patients? If you have, and it may be being able to speak the language of population health as well. So if we're doing a pilot study of diabetics, but you're then asked that physician you're working with, well, how many diabetics does your organization currently see? And do you think this tool would benefit 10%, 20%, 50% of them in the long run? And so, and do you have a population health program wrapped around that, or risk sharing? So the next step would be, how's this going to be paid for? And there are a couple of routes there. One would be some value-based care bundle payments, like I think of the example of what's now called virtual rehab or digital rehab. And there are a lot of organizations right now that are moving into the area of bundled payment for knee and hip replacement. Well, if a digital rehab program or virtual rehab program where you actually interact with the patient remotely so they don't have to come in for those rehab appointments and they can do the exercise as well at home, how much money could that save, and what better outcomes could you get for a population like that? So you have to begin to think about, in the long run, this is going to get paid for either out of a bundled payment or value-based program, or in some cases, there are new CPT codes for reimbursement under Medicare for remote patient monitoring. So that's not a treatment, but it's the modern monitoring side. So you really have to become savvy on how is this going to be paid for, and that's how it's going to scale.
Yeah, we've had some conversations with health innovators about, not just getting really excited about a pilot and, acquiescing to any terms, but, negotiating that pilot agreement to make sure that they have funding, that, if they achieve certain benchmarks, they're, willing to actually purchase something on a much bigger scale going forward if they have a successful pilot. Yeah.
Yeah, and I've only heard of one company, I think it is a Canary Health, that has a guarantee, outcomes guarantee. So they, you get the tool free as a provider organization if they don't meet their outcome targets for chronic illness. But I think they're the only ones trying to do that. It's very risky, but it's taking on the risk really of the that the provider would usually get stuck with. So that's a very innovative business model, and we'll see if it works. but
Yeah.
the other, well, and this may get to our too far down the road to what we'll talk about later, but I think if you look at successful companies, so that's the other thing too, as a startup, is who really has made it and is going, either has been acquired or has gotten financial success just based on going from pilot to larger studies to scale. And if you look at those companies, they're the ones that have on their website a tab, and I don't think usually website tabs mean very much, but they have a tab that says evidence or outcomes. And then you look at that and you get to see, you can see their pilot studies, but you can see studies that then go up to 150 patients, 500 patients, and so on. And then you can see they're really doing it right because they have the evidence showing that this works on more and more patients every time they do a study.
Yeah.
And they tweak their model too, as they scale.
Sure. Absolutely. Learning every step of the way
Right.
and iterating. So, we had talked about a number of different things or strategies and tactics that health innovators need to include in their commercialization plan. What's 3 tactics that you suggest that every health innovator has in their plan?
Well, I've thought about this before, and it's always hard to narrow it to 3, but I'll try.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, I think one is really understand the complexity of the healthcare system and what your niche will be in that system. Because obviously a single solution isn't going to solve all the problems. So, and part of that finding your niche is I'm using 2 for this one. I'm cheating.
Okay. I'll give you 4.
Not duplicating anything that's out there. Obviously, at this point in the market, don't even try to build an electronic medical record.
Right.
That field is saturated.
Yep.
Even tools for diabetics or diabetic prevention programs, that's been saturated by some very successful companies. So where are you going to insert yourself and be successful? And obviously there's some areas that are going to be need multiple solutions. So anyway, that's 1 or 1.5. I think also a strong partnership with a physician or some provider. In some cases, it might be nurses. And I think nurses are underutilized resources in healthcare innovation. But have a strong partnership with a healthcare organization, and not just their innovation center, but have a physician champion. And part of that solves a previous problem, that they understand the complexity of reimbursement, treatment, liability, chronic care management. And you need to educate yourself about all those things and know enough, because they're all potential failure points if you don't get it. And then a third one is, I would say, usability. And usability is interesting because I think it covers both the provider side and the patient side. So depending on the tool, a lot of the tools, whether it's something like remote monitoring or a prevention program, or even digital therapeutics, a treatment program, you have most of them will have some consumer or patient-facing element. And that has to be easy to understand, intuitive, and that means also that you need to do testing with real patients. and not just build what you think will work, or and some of that's through iteration, granted, but and then and I think one of the most valuable things that is underrated, or not sometimes even ignored, is a health dashboard concept. So if you're doing, for instance, a remote monitoring for a specific condition, and there are a lot of good tools for this in diabetes, again, and some other areas, can you see on your dashboard in simple terms, just like you would with a Fitbit, where you stand today as a patient? And I think patients are getting used to this idea from activity monitors, and it should translate relatively easily to remote monitoring tools. And then if for the physician side, the data needs to be integrated and displayed, preferably embedded into the electronic medical record, but if not, easily reached from there, or part of a telemedicine center that's monitoring this population. So I guess that's 3. Or 5.
Yeah, right, exactly. How important is it, do you think, for health innovators to involve patients, real patients, in the product development process?
I think it's if it's not the number 1 success factor, obviously you have to have money, but maybe it's number 2. I think it's that important, because I myself have been through this experience, not innovating per se, but talking to a lot of companies. But I went to a conference of people with type 1 diabetes several years ago in California, in Silicon Valley. And these are very tech savvy group with type 1. But I had no idea what they were going through, what it was like to live insulin dependent. And one of the most shocking aspects for me, and I thought I knew a lot about the patient experience, the most shocking thing for me is several people said outright, I realize any night I go to bed, I could die. Just, it's the most, I've dealt with cancer patients and a lot of others, but to know that because your glucose, your blood sugar could bottom out at night and you wouldn't even wake up.
Right. Yeah.
And there hasn't been a good solution for that technically or medically, is just shocking. Now there are solutions like the closed loop, what's called an artificial pancreas, which is really working for a lot of people now. But those are the kinds of things you only learn if you talk to patients about their day-to-day experience and how this technology is going to fit into that.
We have a framework, a co-creation framework that we take health innovators through, kind of giving them a clear path with that. We call it the 5 co's, because it's not just product development, but it's co-validation, co-ideation, co-testing, different phases of the co-creation or product development process. How do you recommend that health innovators get patients involved in the process? And are there any pitfalls that they need to be aware of?
Well, I think the way to do it is to find what are considered patient experts, and organizations like WeGo Health have patient experts. A lot of these people with advanced degrees who are also maybe in other fields, but are savvy enough tech-wise that they understand both their illness and their what technologies really help. And there are plenty of people out there. You could also partner with specific organizations, like we have just partnered with the United Spinal Association, which I had never heard of before. But It's people with spinal cord injuries who are wheelchair bound, very savvy, both in terms of government policy and getting the tools they need to live good lives.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's one. The pitfall is using patients that are too focused or are angry because they've had bad healthcare experiences,
Mm-hmm.
which is not helpful. But I think the ones who have, and then there's some that are too tech savvy and then don't appreciate what people who are either health or IT or both illiterate
Mm-hmm.
and how they would use a specific technology. So I think you need to look at what population you're focusing on and what kinds of patients you need.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So you've written a lot about, the dilemma that we face when it comes to the language that we use. Tell me a little bit, in our audience, a little bit about this phenomenon, and what are some of the things that health innovators need to be mindful of when it comes to their messaging strategy and how they communicate with stakeholders.
Depends on the stakeholder. I mean, we could
Patients,
just broadly
providers.
say,
Yeah.
patients and providers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, with providers, again, I think it goes back to understanding what it's both what it's like to be a provider. There was an article, I think, out of Stanford where a doctor was suggesting, if you want to provide an innovation for me, you should shadow me for a day to see what it's really like. And that might involve more than 12 hours, by the way. So understanding that, and the understanding that they don't want additional burdens. They want things that simplify their work and make it more effective. So I think that on the provider side, it's really understanding them, but also understanding the terminology like population health and bundled payments. So you understand the financial side as well as the clinical side. It's a real challenge, but it's worth every minute of learning that. On the patient side, I think it's, I think you could begin with focus groups, perhaps, but you have to ask the right questions. And sometimes not so much questions. I think, again, it would go back to, tell me about your day. What's a day like with this disease? And what challenges do you face every day with this disease? And what are your biggest headaches? And do you have a smartphone? Do you use it all the time? Are you used to using apps? What are the best apps you have? On your phone, what apps do you have on a phone? What do you use all the time? And then you begin to see, oh, okay, this particular group still use flip phones, so I'm in trouble.
Right. Believe it or not,
they use
that's happened.
smartphones. Right, they use smartphones, or they use tablets. A lot of, particularly elderly, I think, use tablets, and the thing they use the most is Skype, so they can talk to their grandchildren.
Sure.
So, all right, so those interfaces are good. Well, maybe you'd be a good candidate for telemedicine, if that's the case, or whatever. So I think it's really sitting in, but throughout the product life cycle, you may have an advisory group initially, but I think it'd be helpful just to have a kind of if you can afford it, a patient expert as a consultant throughout the life cycle process is actually at the table. So you're making a product decision or an upgrade decision, and they say, wait a minute, that's not going to work.
Right.
And then I think that's part of avoiding the failure is having the advice right up front, whether it's a usability issue or something else.
Well, in kind of what you're indicating is that that's better to know throughout the journey instead of once the product is developed and it's out into the marketplace. It can be very expensive and almost life-threatening to the company to find out, when you're so far down the road in the development.
Yeah, definitely. So
So
if you could build it right the first time, and
yeah, yeah,
you don't have to
right.
worry about that.
Yeah, definitely.
Or less iteration, maybe.
So, do we have any concerns right now? There's a lot of conversation in the industry about, provider centric, patient centric, or patients, or are they people? And, the language that we're using around that. Speak to
Yeah.
that a little bit.
It's still a very tough one. I'm shifting myself from just talking about patients. Obviously, the term patient engagement has been around for a long time. It's beginning to shift away from that. I think part of the reason is, and I don't remember the exact statistic, but I've heard it over and over again that even somebody with a chronic disease, a severe illness, is going to interact with the provider maybe 10 or 12 times a year, maybe have one hospitalization, maybe not even that.
Right.
Compared to all the other hours, they're really on their own with their illness, and don't always have the right tools to manage that or the right knowledge. So you can be a patient if you're in the hospital, but you're still a person. But I don't use person enough. In Europe, they often use the term citizen, but that's more a European-centric, socialized medicine concept, maybe more so. But I like it, but it just doesn't make sense here in the U.S. So I've been using consumer/patient, consumer first. And a lot of people don't like consumer because does that mean everything is commercial?
Right.
And commercialized. So I don't have a good answer to it. I think the ideal thing would be person. I do use that too, like person with diabetes, person with COPD, rather than, a diabetic or, other terms which seem to pigeonhole people, I think. So I think people with, or a person with a specific condition. And we've had a whole Twitter stream now on this term that I was engaged with this week on the term problem list even. So why, for me as a patient, do I have problems? I really have conditions or symptoms.
Sure.
I'm not a problem. And that's obviously a physician-oriented terminology that doesn't translate well or feels insulting potentially. So, I think we do need to be careful, and, the patient dashboard may use different terminology than the physician dashboard, and that's okay. We're still talking about the same conditions or problems or diagnoses.
I think those are great observations and insights that our audience will find valuable. So we have, a handful of people that have joined our live show today, innovators that are in the trenches right now. What are, what's some of the advice that you have for them?
You want 3 more points or 5? I don't know.
Give us
Well, I
what you
think we
got.
covered most of it. I mean, most of it would be by way of summary. I'll try to think of something that I haven't talked about so far. Well, I think by way of summary, healthcare is complex and not easily disruptive. And part of it is understanding the financial transition or the means of payment transition we're going through from fee for service. And, I think the worst case scenario that fee for service has forced us into in trying to treat chronic disease is, for instance, you're newly diagnosed with asthma. All right, here's a prescription for an inhaler. Here's some patient education materials and paper. Good luck, and I'll see you in a month.
Mm-hmm.
and, call me if you have a problem or go to the emergency room. Those are not good alternatives for helping me manage my disease. That's just a recipe for disaster as far as I'm concerned.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what we're shifting to in digital health is more continuous monitoring of a condition so you know how you're doing. And treatment, personalized treatment is also the term precision medicine, which is a little more heavy into genomics, which I don't want to get into, but personalized treatment. So if you see, for instance, if you have a digital, going back to asthma, you have a digital inhaler that gives you feedback on how often you're using your regular inhaler versus your rescue inhaler, and you understand, and the app tells you, the pollution levels when you were using your rescue inhaler 3 times in a row in an hour, and
Mm-hmm.
say, maybe I should avoid that, or think twice about that kind of an environment, and just so you learn the solution teaches you as a patient how to manage your illness, helps you with it on a day-to-day basis. This is true in a lot of coaching apps as well. And then helps you understand how to adjust your medical treatment. And in some cases, that might be actually the physician or a nurse or a telemedicine center calling you and saying, we're seeing these monitoring numbers, and they may not say it, but our algorithm tells us that you could end up in the emergency room in the next 2 days if we don't change your medication. So that, again, gets personalized. Based on continuous monitoring, we can customize your treatment. And that's a big difference than ending up in the emergency room and a doctor who never saw you before says, well, we're going to increase your medicine. We're going to add another medication, and good luck. And then you're back in the emergency room within a week because you're not getting good continuity of care or continuous monitoring. So I think in the future, my vision is that continuous monitoring, if it's done right and has the right staffing and has the right user interface that really teaches the patient about their illness and the treatment, that will have a lot better outcomes. And that should be the goal for anybody in starting up in this space. How do I get to that point? There are a lot of ingredients. Let's make sure we cover all the bases. And, which doesn't mean you burn through all your cash in 6 months necessarily, but you do it in smart ways and you get the right advice from the right people and your physician champion and maybe nurse champion, and figure this out, and patient champion. So,
yeah, absolutely. It's great insights that you've shared with us today. Thank you so much. And so how can our audience get a hold of you? What's the best way for them to connect with you?
the easiest way is Twitter, but and it's just at John Sharp. So I was an early adopter in 2007, I think. That's how I got my name.
Great.
Forever. I'm also on LinkedIn, also just as John Sharp. My email is jsharp@hims.org.
And the HIMSS conference is in just a couple of weeks?
Yeah, it starts February 11th in Orlando, in your neighborhood.
Yep.
And at the Orange County Convention Center. And we're expecting 45,000 of our closest friends and a mile of exhibit space. So wear good shoes. We're really excited.
So connect with John there, and I'll be there as well. So feel free to reach out and stay connected. And until next time, let's raise our COIQ. What's the difference between launching and commercializing a healthcare innovation? Many people will launch a new product, few will commercialize it. To learn the difference between launch and commercialization, and to watch past episodes of the show, head to our video show page at drroxy.com. Thanks so much for watching and listening to the show. You can subscribe to the latest episodes on your favorite podcast app, like Apple Podcasts and Spotify, or subscribe to the video episodes on our YouTube channel. No matter the platform, just search COIQ with Dr. Roxy. Until next time, let's raise our COIQ.